Okay, so I'm going to talk about the outlook for living standards and government support for the cost of living. The outlook for living standards is frankly quite dire. The OBR forecast and that real household disposable incomes will fall by 7% over the next 2 years. Now, this chart shows the year-on-year change in real household disposable incomes over a long period of time. We see that since 2008, we've seen a number of shocks to real incomes, many more than we've seen in previous decades. But the falls in real income we're expected to see in the next 2 years are far larger still than the shocks in recent history. And indeed, they're the largest falls we've seen since record began. This comes on top of already more than a decade of lost growth since the 2008 crisis. And the OBR forecast that we won't return to pre-pandemic levels of real household incomes until after the 2027-28 financial year. Now, the blue line here plots what would have happened to real household disposable incomes had the pre-2008 trend continued. And I've shown this chart a couple of times and it gets more ridiculous each time. But according to the OBR's forecasts, by 27-28, we're going to be nearly a third poorer than we would have been had the pre-2008 trend in growth continued. The grim outlook in living standards over the next 2 years comes despite a large package of government support for the cost of living crisis. So the Chancellor's confirmed that the energy price guarantee will carry on into the next fiscal year. The typical household energy bills will be capped at £3,000 a year, which is estimated to cost 38 billion over the next fiscal year. Now, this compares to a cost of 55 billion to keep the cap at the current £2,500 level until September 2024, which is what Kwasi Kwarteng intended. So compared to a situation in which the government did nothing and there was no energy price guarantee, the median household would save £270 per year as a result of the energy price guarantee. However, even with the guarantee, most households will see a large rise in their energy bills. So the median household will see an increase in their energy bills of £900 compared to today, when there's a 2,500 cap in place and most households have access to this £400 energy rebate. And compared to the last fiscal year before the energy crisis happened, the median household will see an increase in bills of £1,800. Now, I've said that the median household will see an increase in £900 in bills compared to today. However, there's huge variation in how much energy bills will increase depending on how much energy households use. So this bar here plots the distribution in the increase in energy bills, and we see that 1 in 4 households will see an increase of less than £700, so that's the 25th percentile, whilst more than 1 in 4 households will see an increase of more than £1,200. You see this variation in the increase in energy bills right across the income distribution. So even for the very poorest households, those in the lowest decile of household incomes, 1 in 4 households will face a rise in energy bills of more than £1,150 compared to today. The Chancellor's also announced another package of one-off cost of living grants, totaling £11 billion in the next fiscal year. These grants will be targeted at specific households, so there's no universal component, and the £400 energy discount that almost all households got this year will no longer be in place next year. Households on means-tested benefits will receive £900 next year, with additional support for pensioners and those on disability benefits. Turning now to ordinary benefits, so not benefits specifically targeted at the cost of living crisis, the Chancellor is committed to uprating most main working age and disability benefits with CPI inflation. So in April next year, they'll go up by 10.1%. Now, this is a big increase, roughly keeping pace with inflation, but it won't make up for the falls in real benefits last year when the benefit uprating failed to keep up with inflation. And as a result, real benefits won't return to their pre-pandemic levels until after April 2024. So I'll talk about this in more detail later. In addition, the Chancellor's announced a one-off operating of the benefit cap with CPI next year. So the benefit cap affects around 130,000 households as of May 2022. These are mostly large households and those with high housing costs, and it's been frozen in cash terms since April 2016. So the operating of the cap with inflation is obviously welcome and will come as a big relief to these households. However, it's disappointing that the Chancellor hasn't committed to operating the benefit cap in line with main working age benefits going forward, as we recommended in the Green Budget. And we see clearly that operating the cap by 10% next year is a positive change, but in a context when prices have increased by 24%, that still means a big cut in real terms since April 2016. I should note also that although most benefits have been operated with inflation, the housing element of benefits for private renters, the local housing allowance, has been frozen in cash terms since April 2020. And since April 2020, there's been a 6% increase in average private sector rents. Now, I've said that real benefit levels won't return to their pre-pandemic levels until April 2024. This is because benefits are only operated once a year with a lagged measure of inflation. So benefits are operated in April using inflation measures in the previous September. And the fact that we've had consecutive years of rising inflation since the pandemic means that benefits are lagging behind the cost of living. So this chart shows the average benefit entitlement of out-of-work claimants in real terms, excluding the housing element, which, as I said, has been frozen. And you see that because of rising inflation, the real value of benefits fell between 2019 and April 2022. The current operating is just keeping pace with inflation, so keeping pace with this lower level of benefits. And it won't be until April 2024, when inflation subsides, that real benefit levels actually catch up to their pre-pandemic levels. So the fact that real benefit levels are lagging inflation is one of the reasons that the government's introduced these one-off cost of living grants. Another reason being that lower income households spend more of their money on energy and food, which have gone up steeply in prices. And we see here that on average, abstracting from differences in inflation faced by households, so assuming all households face the same levels of inflation, we see that on average, these cost of living grants have roughly kept real benefits at around pre-pandemic levels. However, this is just the picture on average, and really flat rate grants are not a good substitute for just operating benefits with current inflation. That's because there's huge variation in how much benefits people get. So in this chart, I'm plotting the number of households receiving different levels of universal credit per month, and you see that there's huge variation. So £900 a year in cost of living grants will be a huge increase for those receiving very low levels of universal credit. So for example, for the 160,000 households receiving less than £100 a month, but it won't go very far at all for those receiving very high levels of benefits. Another issue with a flat rate grant is that it creates a cliff edge. So someone at the very end of the UC taper will be entitled to the full £900, whereas someone earning just above that will receive nothing at all. So bringing together the cost of living support, the benefit measures we've seen, as well as the tax measures that Stuart talked about. Here I'm showing the effect of these policies on households across the income distribution. And we see that before the autumn statement yesterday, there was already a progressive set of policies planned for the next fiscal year compared to the tax and benefit system in November 2021. So at the bottom of the distribution, the changes to the universal credit taper, which make universal credit more generous for in-work households, as well as some indirect tax measures, will boost incomes at the bottom of the distribution, whilst freezes to income tax thresholds would reduce incomes for higher income households. Now, the measures announced yesterday reinforce this progressive pattern, with the cost of living support targeted at low-income households, whilst the rise in employer NICs and the lowering of the additional rate threshold mostly hitting high-income households. The energy price guarantee, the savings from the energy price guarantee are broadly evenly distributed across the distribution, and overall households will gain in cash terms on average, with lower-income households gaining more in cash terms. I want to be very clear that I'm just talking about cash changes as a result of these policies. I'm absolutely not saying that lower income households are going to be better off next year, given the rising price levels that they'll see. So looking into the longer term, to 2027, 28, after the temporary support expires and after the cost of living crisis subsides, we see that policies will result in tax rises across most of the distribution, with the autumn statement reinforcing previous plans. Bigger falls in incomes largely due to the decision to keep tax thresholds frozen up until 2027. So overall, you see that the lowest income households will see increases in their income as a result of tax and benefit changes since November 2021. And most of the distribution will see decreases in their income, with the biggest falls coming at the top of the distribution. So to summarize, we're heading for another lost decade of income growth, with the next 2 years being the biggest falls in real household income on record. And this is despite another big package of support for households in response to the rising cost of living crisis. Despite the support, the median household will still face a rise of £900 in energy bills compared to today, and £1,800 compared to last year. The cost of living support this time around will be targeted at specific groups. There'll be no universal element, and as such, we can expect some middle income households to really suffer next year. Ordinary benefits, so not benefits related to the cost of living crisis, will be uprated with inflation next year. However, they'll still lag pre-pandemic values in real terms until April 2024. Now, this is part of the reason for the cost of living grants that we're seeing, but as I said, these flat rate grants are really not a good substitute for simply uprating benefits with current levels of inflation. Overall, taking the tax and benefit measures as a whole, we see that these are a progressive set of policies. In the next fiscal year, we'll see the poorest households gaining the most in cash terms, whilst the richest households will lose out. And in the long run, to 2027, 28, we'll see tax rises across most of the income distribution, with the largest rises taking place at the top of the distribution.